We're live.
No, it's preparing it now. Sorry. We are live now.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you so much, Omar. And good evening, everyone. I am Manny Santiago. I use any pronouns, and I have the honor of serving the people of Washington through my role as the executive director of the Washington State LGBTQ Commission. Tonight, we have a wonderful uh, pair of wonderful people who are doing great work, and you'll meet them in a second. We are going to be talking about the anti-Asian hate and hatred that is it's been increasing in the U.S. in the last few months, and actually for it's part of the history of the United States. And recently, we have seen more and more anti-Asian hate. We want to excuse me, to also see the connection between LGBTQ and queer identities and Asian identities, and how that plays out, and how can we support each other in this work. I also want to recognize that I am not a person of Asian descent, so I am honored to have two wonderful voices that represent only their voices and their experiences also, right? Like we're not gonna pretend that every experience is universal. And at the same time is going to be important to hear personal experiences, and to build those relationships, and to continue learning more about our communities and the intersection between our ethnicities and race, and our LGBTQ identities. So with all that said, thank you so much for tuning in, everyone. I do want to do a land acknowledgement. We know that we are in stolen lands, and we want to recognize that, and affirm our commitment to justice. So if you join me in reflecting on these words. The Washington State LGBTQ Commission recognizes that we live and work in stolen lands. These lands, water, mountains, skies, and everything within them have been inhabited since time immemorial by the descendants of the 29 federally recognized tribes, as well as the many not recognized tribal communities in the state of Washington. The members of this panel tonight are currently in the ancient lands of the Puyallup, Coast Salish, Duwamish, Muckleshoot, Suquamish, and Kanaka-Owi peoples. We recognize the history of colonization, genocide, subjugation, and enslavement experienced by indigenous peoples in these lands and throughout the continent. It is our commitment as a state agency to recognize tribal sovereignty, to work alongside tribal partners for the well-being of our communities, to celebrate the achievements of the many indigenous communities among us, and to dismantle the ongoing legacy of settled colonialism, as well as the exclusion and erasure of indigenous peoples that continues today. And may it be so. Well, friends, as I said, we have two wonderful panelists tonight, and we're going to have a wonderful conversation tonight. And I want to introduce them, obviously. Our first panelist is Rosa Mai, who is the project manager for the State Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. She is a second-generation Vietnamese American with a deeply rooted passion for policy advocacy and improving government systems through a lens of equity. Welcome, Rosa. Boji Maggio is from Lakewood. He was born in the Philippines and raised in Japan and the US. He is passionate about quality of life through access to healthcare and health outcomes, and currently manages an elderly care business in his city of Lakewood. Welcome, Boji. And Boji is currently in Hawaii. So thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so Folk, we want to hear a little bit more about you, and we heard about a little bit about you already from your background, but we would like to hear a little bit more about you. and how you identify what is important for you in your identities, and how these identities intersect with each other, and how you navigate the world with these identities. So who wants to start? I'm not going to assume that anyone wants to or call anyone out. So it is a conversation. So who wants to start?
I can go first. I'll
Go
keep it
ahead.
light, and Rose, we can kind of like throw back and forth. So as Manny said, hi everyone. My name is Boji. My Samoan name is Filiva'a Mayutumanga the third, and my Filipino nickname is Boji. So I always start with names first. In our culture of Samoa, your name is a living, breathing thing, and so a lot of my journey is understanding what my Samoan name means. And then in my culture, the Philippines, names are always nicknames. So I'm sure you've met Filipino people in your journey, but Boji is definitely a nickname, and you'll find a lot of fun nicknames such as Baby, Bong, and just a fun list. And I got Boji. So that's my first marker of identity is my name. Second is culture. So a fun fact about being raised in Japan is that my father was in the Air Force. And so on a military base was definitely a bubble that kind of felt a little more of the kind of idolized America in the 90s, where everyone's getting along. And so we were on a military base in Japan. And so I definitely culturally identify as American in that I was raised on military bases as well as in Lakewood, where I'm from. But my mom is from the Philippines, so I am Filipino and I am Samoan. So as I get older now, I think through Lakewood as kind of my new anchor. And so getting connected to my Samoan side and my Filipino side has been really through business. A lot of Filipino entrepreneurs. And so definitely on that side. And then my connection to Samoans through the Asia Pacific Cultural Center, where I've done work was because of my father being on that board, but more recently through being proudly Fa'afafine, which is in the way of a woman in Samoan, where Utopia is the org that I rep. So I definitely want to throw that out there that I'm proudly Filipino, and I don't use numbers when I talk about identity. I really say I'm Filipino and Samoan. I think quantifying it, which is definitely common, is something I try to like rebel in and say, hey, I'm 100% if I have to say Filipino and 100% Samoan. The mathematicians might look at me and say, what's up with that? But I'm proudly like 1,000,000% of everything, because I think being gay kind of gives you the challenge to say, all right, I am everything, every color, everything. So that's how I identify racially and ethnically and culturally. And then at the end of the day, gender identity wise, last year during the pandemic, took some time to learn a lot more about what gender identity means to me. And as I learned my native words of Fa'afafine in Samoan, I felt more drawn to that than terms queer or gay. I don't get a public space to acknowledge it. And so it's really nice to have this chance to say, I'm proudly Fa'afafine, and in the home we serve in such a caregiver role. We're kind of the everything group. So cooking, as well as caregiving, as well as keeping the energy light, as well as going through the hard parts, that I think that's a part of my queer identity that I want to acknowledge, which is Fa'afafine. And then on my Filipino side, Bading or Bakla, and then other terms that you might hear. So those hopefully kind of introduce little areas of me of who I am and who I identify.
Thank you, Boji. Rosa.
That was really, really beautiful, Boji. Thank you for sharing that. And I wanted to just bounce off of a little bit of what Boji said about identifying as American, because I don't really talk about myself and my identity very often, just because whenever I do, it tends to lead to a lot of tangents because I have complicated feelings about everything. So I'm second generation Vietnamese American, like I said. I'm the daughter of refugees. Young bisexual Vietnamese woman, Vietnamese American woman living in White Center, lifelong White Center kid. So whenever I say Vietnamese American, or rather whenever I write it down, I always just write both, no hyphen, and I'm always very intentional about that when I write, because this was a debate that I started to become aware of back when I was in high school, that people had very mixed feelings about the hyphen. And it just struck me as weird because it's just a hyphen, but there's always that feeling of conditionality, like you are Vietnamese American, like one is contingent on the other or something like that. And like Boji said, it's 100% both. And at the same time, it also feels like a little bit of neither at times, because you exist in these strange identities that at times feel contradictory, but still exists simultaneously. I am 100% Vietnamese, I'm 100% American. And that's the case for every part of my identity. Grew up really Catholic, still kind of am, even though it's, again, contradictory at times. And so all of these little different orbs of my identity, they mesh into a whole bunch of complicated Venn diagrams that is me.
Yeah, and oh my God, I cannot talk today. It is always very interesting to see how society wants to label us, right? According to what they see or perceive, or how the people that interact with us, the lens that they come through into any relationship that we build with them, whether it's just, a moment or a long-term friendship. It's always somebody else identifying you and telling you who you should be according to what they think you should be. And it's always interesting as a Latino person, right, of Puerto Rican descent, is yeah, I am 100% everything. And both of you mentioned, actually, no, Rosa mentioned religion a little bit. And for those of you who don't know, that's my background. So in theology, in Christian theology, to talk about 100% two things, it's good math. So, and Boji knows about this. We've had many conversations about religion. So talking or speaking a little bit about identity, we recognize that, and one of the reasons why we wanted to host this panel during the month of May is because in the United States, May is recognized as Asian and Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian Heritage Month. Now, the Pacific is big. It is composed of many countries, many ethnicities, many realities, and so is Asia, even larger space, right? That goes from Turkey all the way through to the Koreas and Japan and the Philippines. So there are many experiences of what it means to be Asian, what it means to be Pacific Islander, what it means to be Native Hawaiian. Excuse me. And my question to both of you is, how do you approach that reality that in the United States we have combined all these identities, all these realities, and assign a month randomly, perhaps, to celebrate this heritage, and we only use heritage in the singular, when in reality there's so many identities and so many realities. So can you share your own experience, your own opinion about these? And also, because we want to recognize that that's a flaw, right, in recognizing the diversity of both the Pacific Islander community and the Asian community.
So I can speak a little bit on this, and Boji, you're like always feel free to jump in. But like from my perspective as an individual and from working with Kappa, it's always this double-edged sword, right? The term Asian American as an identity was coined back in the 60s when Japanese, Chinese, and Filipino communities came together on college campuses to just create a space for themselves to talk about Asian issues, to talk about their collective issues. And they were, where you had individual communities before that, where they had to fight for themselves, coming together like that gave them a united front. It gave them solidarity to draw on, to be able to push their issues. So for instance, when Vincent Chin was murdered in 1982, you didn't have just the Chinese community showing up, you had the whole Asian American community calling on justice for a community member. But on the other hand, like nowadays, there's a reckoning with the term API, as there should be, because it is often it often erases the individual needs of communities in there. Like the Pacific Islander community is a perfect example. People are talking about Stop API Hate, and even though Pacific Islanders get drawn into this anti-Asian hate movement, I shouldn't say it like that. Sorry, that was very poor phrasing. The anti-Asian hate sentiment and all that. Like there are Pacific Islander victims of anti-Asian hate right now. On the other hand, it's mostly, a lot of this hate is being directed towards East and Southeast Asians right now. So there's that complexity and fluidity to it. Moreover, right now when we say Stop Asian Hate, like I said, a lot of that is just directed towards the East and Southeast Asian communities. They're people who honestly look like me, a lot paler, dark hair, that kind of thing, where you look and the average layman just thinks Asian. But for instance, they're not considering hate towards, say, the South Asian community. When a gunman killed, I believe, 8 people at a FedEx in Indianapolis, most of the victims were Sikh Americans, but nobody was calling on that to be investigated as a hate crime outside of the Sikh coalition. So there's a lot of erasure that comes from the Asian American umbrella, right? So like, it's that complicated double-edged sword. On the one hand, you have solidarity in numbers, you have that collective power, but on the other hand, you run the risk of erasing the individual needs of the very, very diverse communities that live under that umbrella.
Thank you. Boji. Well, I think that
what I can share is, I
are.
think last year during the just to share on a personal note, during the 2020 census, I was living with 2 other people at the time. We're people of color, and one was Vietnamese, myself being mixed. I'd never seen, she didn't either. None of us saw that this new list of nationalities were available to us and how we identified. And so the first time in my census experience got to fill out Samoan as my and Filipino. And so when I think of an experience recently where being clumped felt like just to balance out through the census last year, and the chance to fill out 2 boxes where in 10 years ago, filling out just Pacific Islander, or not even that. I think it might have been Asian and Pacific Islander. You can only choose one. So I think whatever happened in the 10 years kind of befuddled me. And then leadership from a California-based organization named Langafa taught me that they had championed for more representation, specifically Samoan, on the census. So I know there's a lot of things at play, but to see Samoan on the census recently was one way that I felt maybe there is a needle being moved where nationally that we can see, let's say, the King or Pierce County area of Samoans able to like self-identify in the census. So I guess I'll share just that personal anecdote on how that was a positive, and obviously plenty more on the side, but I just wanted to definitely in a more national way felt seen, and also to choose 2 boxes.
Which is great because it does it then recognizes the 100% you, right? And being able to claim and reclaim your full and whole identity. So let's talk a little bit about the intersection between your queer or LGBTQ identity and your Asian or Pacific Islander identity, and how, what does it mean? Not how, what does it mean for you to embody your whole self as a person who identifies with both communities or more?
I would like to think it's super fun. I think before what was trauma and a lot of hardship, just navigating it, being, in your own closeted self. And for me, that was a pretty big journey, but to be able to now own it and then discover how to intersect what was the times before colonialism, like the home space for people that are gay or queer. And so I think of home a lot more, obviously, because of the pandemic and how much more powerful it is to know your role at home. And that could look different for people, but in my scenario, it is multi-generational. How do you lift each other up? So I think it's fun. I think it's a lot easier now. I think media has been a little bit more of a interesting landscape, thankfully through YouTube and seeing how other countries, specifically the Philippines and Samoa, even in the Pacifica region, are able to bring content that reflects the folks who are living these truths. So I think that's where I'll kind of lean on my more optimistic side. I have had the times before where I'm at that sweet age where people want to like introduce me to their daughter, or, they have their expectations of me in the next decade. I'm in the I'm 30-ish, right? So you feel that. So that's not the not so fun part. And I'm kind of running out of excuses, but hopefully one day in our culture, It's like, I'm proudly Papafina, or I'm proudly Bading, and this is my role in my life. And then please hold on all questions, right? But I think now with the future, it's a little brighter than before. And then obviously still accepting that there are going to be times where just never fit in when you're this special, you know? So I guess that's something I offer is definitely more fun and a lot different than it was a couple of years ago.
Yeah, and to kind of just bounce off of that, I'm really young. I grew up right around when things were starting to turn with like Obergefell was the big one. Obergefell happened like right when I graduated high school. So yeah, I'm very young. So it was it was like this big turning for me where I think that for lack of a better term, it just gave me the language that I can use to talk about myself, you know, like what had before just existed as vague ideas that I never really tried to broach. I finally had like the tools to be able to say like, okay, this feels like me, and really come into my full self, you know, really be able to say, this is me, like not just this feels like me, like this is me. And like having the vocabulary to be to define what me is, what I am. So like what you said, media has really helped with that, because I'm really happy to be living in a time when we're having like such diverse media come out. For most small creators and even like larger content creators, and giving us like just representation on screen, off screen, everywhere in between, in stories, because like it gives me a chance to just grapple with parts of my identity that I never thought of before. Like I never really thought of the fact that I was probably somewhere on the A spectrum until I had that part of my vocabulary, and got the chance to really explore that. Like, and this is a big deal for me also, just because like I said, I'm Vietnamese American, but that means that I primarily grew up speaking English. I spoke Vietnamese at home, but that's a really limited vocabulary. I'm technically fluent, which means that I speak at a 6th grade level, and that's about it. But like for me, right, I can't talk about being queer because the only word that we have for that, as far as I know, is derogatory. It comes from the French word for like stupid or incompetence. So and obviously I feel really uncomfortable using that term. So like for me, at least, as an American, I've been able to come to terms with it because I've had the language for it, and I'm slowly broaching into it for Vietnamese stuff, and I'm hoping to have the language to explore that as well.
Wow.
Can I,
Joey.
Manny, can I follow up with
go
that
ahead.
to Rose's question? I think language is such a big part of this journey as being intersectionally both. And I felt that, and I don't know for you, Rosa, if you have not the word that you're referring to, but France, but like if you could enlighten me, because I'm learning Tagalog in the hopes of being understood and understand more. So, and that's something I'm taking on as like the big burden. It's like, all right, if you're going to get fluent, this is the one language, right? I love languages, but could you like share some of your journey, try to bridge that between being native English outside of home? And if you were to go and like learn Vietnamese at that level where you could advocate, or in a way, but any way you can interpret that, that would be my curiosity, how language serves as your home life changes.
Yeah, for sure. So a big part of it is just that now that I'm like when I was a kid, I grew up taking Vietnamese language classes, you know, which is the only reason why I'm still fluent at all. But so I do have like a decent working vocabulary, but now that I've actually reached adulthood, I started meeting with people who were Vietnamese born, and English was like their second or third language. So bilingual folks, and just conversing with them has been really helpful for me, because you know, there's always that generational gap that I've been dealing with my family. So it's hard to speak to them about this. And like I said, I don't have the language there. But for my friends, we kind of just switch back and forth in this sort of Vitlish kind of thing. So nice. It's been, yeah, surprisingly, it's been really helpful for me in terms of language, because, you know, there are some things that I can't translate easily, like how do you translate Supreme Court precedents, you know, but like at the same time, they're able to help me transfer my own language, like, oh, that's not really a term that you really use anymore, or oh god, here's a very like irrelevant example, but at one point somebody was referring to something as, oh, and I was like, what is that? What does that mean? Is it like a flavor I'm not aware of? And she's like, no, it's very hot. Like nóng, and I was like, oh, you're saying hot. Like you're saying it's cool, it's hot. Like they and I just did not realize that was Viet slang, that took an English word, like, oh, that's so hot, and just borrowed it. So it was just really just like these conversations in Vitlish that helped me. And also, like, let's be real, I've been speaking to like old folks all my whole life, so having somebody my age and speaking to them in Vit has really helped me language wise, honest to God. I don't know if that's particularly helpful, but
I think that is really interesting to hear. I mean, we all here are with multiple identities and manage different languages and things like that, and for me it's really interesting to hear how we navigate our own linguistic worlds where we might even use language as a way of making ourselves invisible or making our communities invisible, right? You mentioned, Rosa, about the Vietnamese language not having a word that conceptualizes what we here in this linguistic context of English call LGBTQ or queer, and I think that is part of the invisibilization of our community by so many other external and internal forces that I don't know. It's just fascinating to see how all these things intersect, and at the same time, how words and concepts that have always been there have been trying to be, hidden, like fa fa fine. It was a concept. It's always been there within Samoan communities, and yet when colonization happened, it had to be suppressed, and or the colonizers tried to suppress not only the word but the identity itself. And I think that is fascinating to you know to think about how our own identities, we have to think about them and how they interlock and how they intersect and how to be 100% queer and 100% of who we are, regardless of what the different cultures say that we can and cannot do and be. And we can go there. Like, I love linguistics, so we can keep here.
Yes.
But
And
go ahead.
yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, and Rosa brought it up, meeting people your age range. To anyone who's listening, whether your language skills are, beginner to advanced, the access we have now through the internet has just made it possible to find activist groups, and people are always willing to talk, whether that's through sharing what they're working on or even promoting. And that's a reason why I'm here actually in Hawaii, is, doing my own little journey of learning about my family history. Is I just looked on a website and said, hey, I'd love to do an informational interview. And here I am meeting them. And I think the access to people that you want to are available. And I think that time will come when we can travel again. But it's just so cool to know that there are not just our elders that we have to navigate this with or through. And I don't know if that's something you deal with, guys, but something I deal with is like, how do I be me in a room of elders? And that's just like a question I think a lot of us have had throughout the pandemic, because we haven't had the chance to go to our favorite centers to debrief about life and talk through. And so I really look forward to tapping into like other age range people where it's like, oh, what are your issues that you're facing and all that. But language is a huge part of what I think has been a healing part, is to look at language objectively and say, hey, I can do what I want with you, versus what I feel like the past has been, which is I can only be in what the language has been built, which is you're either this or that. When I think the creativity of being queer and gay and everything in between is really your chance to like take language and make it yours, which I feel is such a great feeling to create and invent, which is what language is, So I just have to put that out there.
And language is always evolving, and we are the ones that use language, so we can create new things and express who we are through language in new ways. So yeah, Rosa, you were saying.
And I think there's also a lot to be said about the reclamation of language, right? The queer community is a really great example, because there were a lot of times when queer was taboo, and literally every part of LGBTQ was taboo. But there's there is a pride and a resilience in reclaiming the language and saying there is nothing taboo with who you are. And so, like, for me, that, like I said, that's a big thing for me because I don't have the Vietnamese language for it. There might be a reclamation movement in Vietnam amongst youth and whatnot, but but to be honest, like, we've always had queer identities. We have queer and trans ancestors and all that. And just because I, as a Vietnamese American, don't have the words for it, does not diminish that history at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for the public that is tuning in, if you want resources on LGBTQ, Asian, and Pacific Islander communities, CAPA, where Rosa works and a state agency, has a wonderful section of their webpage dedicated exclusively to LGBTQ resources for the Asian American and Pacific Islander American community. So visit their website is capaa.wa.gov, and you will find a lot of wonderful resources here in Washington for the queer, Asian American, and Pacific Islander communities. So I want to move on to talk about the violence that is that the communities are experiencing now, especially the South Asian community, the Eastern Asian community. And I want to ask you, and this is a more personal question. I just want to ensure that the public that we have consulted these questions before, so we're not putting people on the spot. But how does it make you feel? How does it make you interact with the world, knowing that this violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islander Americans and Native Hawaiian Americans is happening out there? We recently had some of this violence here in where I live, in the ancient lands of the Puyallup people in Tacoma, and in Seattle recently, places that we always thought as more safe for the communities. So tell us a little bit about how that makes you feel. How do you navigate this world of violence and identities?
So I can jump in here. So the big thing is that, honest to God, whenever I talk about this stuff, the only word that I can come up with is just, I just feel tired, because not only are you just exhausted by the constant barrage of just tragedy that's in the news right now, but you're also just very well aware that this is not just a point in time issue.
Mm-hmm.
You're feeling the weight of history on you. You're feeling the weight of anti-Asian violence that's been systematized, that's been institutionalized throughout US history, in a single moment, just like concentrated into now. And at the same time, you know, like, we're also looking at a time when we're also seeing rising hate crimes against LGBTQ groups. We're seeing,
Mm-hmm.
I think at the moment, we're on track for the deadliest years for trans folks right now. And it's just an honest to God tragedy at every turn. But at the same time, you know, this is not just like a sprint. This is a point in time reference. But we're on a marathon. White supremacist groups are on the rise, and that's the thing that's leading to all this rise in hate crimes across the board, and especially against anti-Asian folks right now. And you look at the news right now, you see it, and you know that you're in it for at least months longer, if not years longer, because this is just one battle in a long, long war that you have to fight. So it's just exhausting at every turn.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I mean, to follow that, personally speaking, I get numb. I think a lot about my mom, and I'm such a mama's boy. And like, if it helps for others, I've definitely taken the path of silence, and that I don't like talking about it. And when I have talked about it, it makes me go in a protector and more of a violent mode to battle the violence, which is, I know, not healthy. But throughout maybe the last couple of months, hearing how even friends who show up to work and have places to have an outlet seems a lot safer and healthier than me just like thinking about my mom constantly vulnerable and her friends constantly out. And I have this new anxiety where I can trust them, but I just don't trust the world. So I'm constantly, how can I phrase this, like, worried about, can you share where you're at on your iPhone with me so I can know exactly where you're at? And that to me doesn't sound like a healthy behavior, but sounds like the only option I have in this time, where if I don't hear anything back from my mom or her friends, or just that age range where they look like the people, my mom looks like the people who are, you know, who have been violently murdered for no reason other than whatever reason they think is valid for murder. So I think I'm numb, but then when I know numb is not correct, I get angry and violent, and I do want to go toward the same, like solve the problem with what the problem has been. But there's just no healthier thing other than being community. And so I think a lot of my numbness and anger has been through taking a little bit of detachment and taking time to observe my feelings and not act on it. And so that's a few things I'd share are those feelings around the people that are getting hurt look like the people I'm related to and who I love dearly.
Thank you, Boji, and thank you, Rosa, for sharing those experiences and being vulnerable with not only with me here, but with the people who are watching. And I think that is important to recognize our feelings, to recognize where we are when violence against our communities is experienced. And I also think that Rosa mentioned white supremacy, and oftentimes we forget to actually name the demons, right? And what is really behind this hatred, not only against the Asian community, but also against the LGBTQ community. White supremacy needs to be condemned, needs to be eradicated, needs to be, signaled as the root cause of this violence. The other thing that we need also to pay attention to, and again, Rosa, you mentioned some of these, is that we often think that this violence is new, is something that came out of the former presidents, victimizing a particular community and a particular section of the world, and then supporters continue with that message. But the truth is that in this country, in the city where I live, Asian communities have been attacked, murdered, run out of the city, literally their possessions burned. And if we don't know that story, if we don't know the history of how our ancestors and the people who are around us are complicit in these historic historical acts of violence that continue today, then we see these as one thing that happened one time, and perhaps it repeats a couple of times, but that's it, when in reality it's a systemic issue rooted in white supremacy. So anyways, I get very
No,
passionate
thank you,
about
Manny,
this,
for
right?
that. No, and you're right. It totally is white supremacy, and Rosa hit on the head. And I think that's also something that we on this call should, if there are resources, Manny, in it throughout, something I know should be a part of our language as we talk about violence is white supremacy, especially in LGBTQ issues. Like white supremacy has been the root for a lot of hatred that has just gone unnoticed, uncalled out. And so thank you. And if you do have resources, I definitely encourage to share, because I'm always wanting to learn ways to discuss this in a way that makes me feel like, okay, this isn't just now, it's something we're going to have to be faced with forever.
Yeah. And the issue of colonization too, right? And Boji, in the Philippines, the Spanish colonization, European colonization in general, the U.S. colonization, Vietnam and France and other European nations, and it's part of who we are as human beings, right? And at the same time, it takes a toll on us, right? Having to live and navigate these realities that oftentimes we forget or want to forget, and we shouldn't. Not that we should continue carrying that burden, but actually recognize it so we can liberate ourselves from that burden. I have to say that, as I said, I grew up in Puerto Rico and a U.S. colony in the Caribbean, and I never, ever read anything about the Japanese internment until I was in my mid-20s. It wasn't presented to us because that was a part of the history of the colonizer that wasn't supposed to be shown, right? And and it's sad, Washington was part of that internment, and the removal of the Japanese community in Washington. And we need to learn about these things. We need to name them. We need to condemn them, and to make sure that we move forward with inclusion and equity and recognizing our past, but not repeating it, especially the violent parts. Um, yeah, I can go on and on. But
He's preaching. Love it.
The other thing, and we have to acknowledge this, especially for cis gay men, and I'm gonna say it, the anti-Asian uh, disgusting how you call these actions and perceptions and stereotypes that exist within the male gay and bisexual community honestly is disgusting, and we need to address that. We as a queer community, as an LGBTQ community, if we want to move forward, we need to address the anti-Asian and anti-Pacific Islander, anti anyone that is not white problem that we have in our community. So that is my call to our community, to address these anti-Asian and anti-Pacific Islander, anti-Native Hawaiian attitudes that exist within the LGBTQ community. And you all know what I'm talking about, right? So I don't have to delve there and go more. I do want to also recognize that we do experience violence, we do see violence, and we also celebrate successes and celebrate who we are. We started with celebrating who we are in all of our, majestic and beautiful holistic selves. So what are some points of pride that you hold dear as an Asian American, a Pacific Islander American queer person? What are some things that you celebrate that you're so proud of that you want to share with all of us and the community?
Well, honestly,
Rose, you want to go? You want to go? Yeah, go for it.
Okay. Well, my thing's actually kind of short. I'll be honest, I just haven't been reading all that much lately. Never had time for it. I only really got back into reading like this year, but oh my God, I've missed out on so much. There is like a treasure trove of queer Vietnamese writers out there. Like Ocean Vuong is the really obvious one. I have his book On Earth We Are Briefly Gorgeous, and I'll be honest, I've only made it halfway through the book because every couple of like lines I have to set it down and cry, and then I restart it. But it's heartbreaking and amazing. Nhi Vo is an amazing author. I've been reading what was it? The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected on Water, Empress of Salt and Fortune. Just like there's so much amazing media, and like I said, a lot of that has helped me just like have like the vocabulary, the ideas to like explore myself, internally, and it's just great media. It's great stories. So that's been a great point of pride for me, just coming back and saying like, oh my God, there's so much queer fantasy out here. There's so much Asian queer fantasy, and I love it. It's such an amazing world to step back into.
And how beautiful it is to see yourself represented in art form that you love, right? Like when you see yourself, yeah. Thank you. Boji.
Yeah, I think the cheeky thing I want to say is behind every strong Miss Universe or Miss Philippines candidate is a gay man and a team of them, right? So, as I speak to my Filipino side, it's just so much fun. There is just a joy that is just just makes me smile. So I definitely think being Filipino and special, it's not just like for beauty queens, right? But just the like fearlessness and the ferocity that I've gotten from a lot of, queer men in the Philippines and queer women. So for my Filipino side, I think it's been a lot more integrated in showbiz as well as bigger public forums. So that's not new. I think more recently, as we were talking earlier about media, I had my first wave of BL series. It's called Boilo series, which was popularized in manga in Japan, where two protagonists that are cis men fall in love. And they have now made it a template on shows. So you're finding, at least in the Philippines, as well as Thailand, shows of two cis men falling in love and what comes with the family dynamics. And I have a few I want to recommend. One is called Game Boys on Netflix, Gaya sa Pelikula on YouTube. And as I, fell in love for the first time last year, I'm looking to these shows to tell me, what do I do after I get my heart broken and I'm coming back? Because I think that's what I'm celebrating, is that we have a chance to see stories like Rosa said, where we're putting ourselves out there and all the stuff that we've had to protect ourselves from having, such as a chance at love and heartbreak or family dynamics at play. And the joy I have is in the creativity behind the makers. So definitely the creatives that are out there. And then more recently with our pandemic situation, just how strong I've seen the leaders at Utopia and APCC step up for our Pacific Islanders too, and how much that COVID really impacted, and that in order for us to really give a good fight, that resources were shared in a way that generosity is just another thing to be proud of. So I guess all that to say that I see those two sides of me being honored in different ways, like the fact that we've had some hardships, but also some good times. And so those are things I'm proud of as I think of my intersections of being, you know, all the things.
Yeah. And celebrating who we are, all of who we are, right? And how that is represented and how we can see ourselves. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's always good to have a point of pride and to recognize that it is not all violence and hatred, that's part of who we are too, because we experience, and that there is always hope because we have the potential to celebrate who we are and to show that to the world. So with that, I do have two final questions, and Omar, who's our executive assistant, is behind the cameras trying to figure out if there's questions, but he let me know that there's no questions from the audience right now. So I have two final questions that I would like to ask you, and it's the same question, just reverse a little bit, but here it is. What are some actions that the LGBTQ community in general can do to signal to the Asian and Pacific Islander and Native Hawaiian communities that we care? From your perspective, and again, I have to say, these are two individuals, two perspectives. This is not speaking on behalf of all Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but from your perspective, what are some things that the LGBTQ community at large can do to show support to the Asian American community?
I can go first, Rosa. I know you've got so many resources with your answers. So the first thing I think of for the LGBTQ community, specifically in the States and a lot of, predominantly white culture, is just to learn more about each of the countries represented in the big term Asian. I think Asian is still catch-all in a lot of conversations when it comes to describing people, and part of that is to learn how that person self-identifies. So I would ask anyone in the LGBTQ community to, if you know someone, and I'm not here to instruct how to ask it, but you need to respect how people self-identify when it comes to their race, and to go directly to Asian or Pacific Islander is a lost opportunity to share that just because they look some way that they don't fit in your box. So that's one really direct way that I would say is just like, I would never want you, like, I'd be curious how people would identify me, but I kind of want that dialogue because it gives us a chance to bond, because then I get to ask them, how do they self-identify? So that's definitely one way I could see the LGBTQ community respecting the API community, is just, how do you self-identify when I talk about you? And that could open up more than just race. It could talk about religion and family structure and residency, whatever, or career even, And so I think that's what's fun, is self-identification before anything.
Thank you. Rosa.
Well, my point is, honestly, this is one that we already mentioned a little bit earlier. Language access is really, really big in the Asian community, and understanding that there's that generational gap. Like I said, I speak great English. My Vietnamese is mediocre, while my mom, she speaks Vietnamese and her English is really mediocre, and trying to find the language materials and whatnot to bridge this gap is really, really difficult. I was the one who compiled the Kappa's LGBTQ resources last year, and in particular, I've really made an effort to try and find language access materials, and it's really, really hard. The most extensive is from the National, the National Queer Alliance of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, I think it was, NACAPIA. I just remembered the acronym. We only exist in acronyms now. But they have really great extensive resources. They also have religious resources, like for the Hindu community, the Hindu community, the Buddhist community, the Catholic community, so on and so forth. And I was just like, oh wow, to have all of that and a fair number of them translated as well as was like a great help, you know. And but the thing is, like I said, there's like a dearth of that. The NCAPIA is very much the exception to the rule. They have some great resources, and I'm waiting for other organizations to do that, to take that same step and make sure that all of the materials are accessible to the people who really need them.
Thank you. So the final question is the reverse. What would you tell, or what would you say to your Asian and Pacific Islander community, or your ethnic community? What can they do, or what are some things that they would do that would show support for the LGBTQ community in general, and certainly for other LGBTQ people of Asian or Pacific Islander descent? And again, I know that is your answer, not the whole LGBTQ spectrum.
Rosa, you want to take that? I'm thinking. Nothing came immediately to mind first.
Like the big thing for me is just like, in reverse, we got to have these conversations as a community. Like there are very few spaces where we as a community, for instance, really have conversations about queerness and about queer identity, you know. The thing is, like, when I think about the LGBTQ community and all that, right, it's very fragmented outside, especially outside of King County. There's at least like enough of us in King County that there's a couple of groups, like there's VITQ at a minimum, right? Yeah, they're an amazing organization, but outside of that, like we need to have these conversations together, and in particular we need to have multi-generational conversations. And like, let's be real, a lot of reasons why I'm saying that is because I'm terrified of the idea of talking about this like by myself, you know. Like, I'll be real, I'm not out to my family, to a lot of my family, you know. Like probably if they're over the age of 30, I have not talked to them about queerness. I did, like, it's part of it's because like I'm perfectly comfortable living as who I am without like them needing to validate me. But it's also like, it's really sad that I because I want to be able to talk to them about it at times, but like I'm terrified of having that conversation, and having that support from a community would mean the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm with you, Rosa. I mean, I'm hoping this video like just gets back to my grandma's cell phone, like, so it does all the dirty work for me. Hi, Grandma. Hello, Grandpa. Trying to make you proud here, one day at a time. No, I'm with you. I think that's the alongside the conversations. I feel like the reverse is easier, where it's like, how can the first question you had, Manny, about what can we do to support people of color, API, non-white people, because that's really less personal. When I feel your queer identity is so personal, and as I think about, yes, I can have this beautiful expression of fafafine or ding ba ding and having references, it's another box too. So I would say having hard conversations one-on-one that are healthy does seem like an impossible task, but I just feel like my life in the future will be defined more by milestones when those moments need to happen, versus like, there's never a convenient time. So I don't know the answer to this question. Maybe that's my long-winded way of saying I don't know. And I don't know if the pressure is to be that mediator quite yet, because I do feel in my gut it's something I'm working on alongside with you here, with you all here, is to have more friends in this conversation where I don't feel alone. So I guess find friends that identify with where you're at. And so in this case, how do I befriend people who have those same identities so we can talk? And that to me sounds like a nice first step before those bigger conversations, if they ever happen or will happen. So my suggestion is friendship, and friendship looks different for everyone, but a place where you feel like playfulness is around the corner, where you feel like you can be your most authentic self, whether in heels or not, or singing or not, and have fun with it. So I would say start with friendship and fun, so that when those days come with elders, that you can start to remember how you felt when you were safe and give that to that person you love, which I would hope is the heart of why we would want to tell elders, I love my grandma and I love my grandfather, so much so that that's what I'm risking putting on the line of telling them, is that it could be taken away. So I guess it's all like muscles and getting to that point where through friendship first, then to the elders. But I guess that's my way of saying how I could give any advice to someone listening is small steps first and go from there.
Thank you. And I think that is important also to, to be present. Just by having this conversation and broadcasting it, and other young Asian American queer folk can see themselves represented, and see, people who are going through journeys very similar to the journeys that they're going through, regardless of their age too, because, coming out is a journey. And we bring cultural baggage and everything with us, right, on this journey of coming out. So I really appreciate the two of you taking the time to share your own experiences, and to be your authentic selves, and to give hope to not only those that are watching right now, but those that are going to hear about these, and who are going to say, oh my God, yes, in Washington, we have a family beyond the one in my local community. There are people out there who are looking after my rights, who are looking after my safety, who are committed to social justice and to changing the systems of oppression. So thank you so much for sharing with us. Is there any final thoughts? We still have 3 more minutes. Not that we have to use them, but is there anything else that you want to share with each other or with the community?
I'll just say, Rosa, thank you for the work that you do. The resource list that you've compiled is just an example of how I'm inspired for the young generation. You were the one that said that you were young, so I'm not putting you in a box, eh? But thank you. I mean, think about how badass it is that you, as someone going into a community or Kappa, where you can look at resources as if it was nothing, where people like me and years before me couldn't get anyone to give resources. So I just want to acknowledge, like, thank you. And anyone who's listening, as Manny has said about coming out is a journey, I have to give props to one of my heroes, Karamo on Queer Eye. That's like my crew, is that it's letting people in. And that's his language around, like, let people in that you want to know sides of you. And it doesn't have to just be about your queer identity. It could be about your dreams and your worries and your fears. And all of us had all those things on the table last year. So I would say choose your friends wisely. That's like my fortune cookie wisdom. Like, choose them wisely and know that your friendship is someone's medicine. And that's my last bit is, that's it. It's friendship that's got me to this place, and Manny's friendship that got me healed, so I can start sharing my stuff out there with a little more hope. It's going to inspire someone else.
Well, I want to say thank you, Manny, for your invitation. I was really okay. So I've been a part of a lot of conversations this month for API Heritage Month. This is the first one where I'm talking about myself. Like, I'm always talking about history, about like API civil rights, so on and so forth. But like, this is the first one that's been about me, and I was super nervous going on for that very reason. But this is a really welcoming space. And Boji, thank you so much for sharing your story. It means a lot to me personally, just because, like I said, I'm still trying to navigate these identities of mine. And hearing about you, hearing your story, really, like, it gives, like I said, it's another part of that. It's like, it's getting the language to talk about that, and you're gonna shout crap. This is really strange, but for me, the queerest thing that I've seen recently is this podcast called The Magnus Archives. It's a horror podcast, and it's like, that's like the number one thing that's really helped me like understand my own queer identity. I will not explain why, because I don't know why, but it is like way more horror than it is gay, but really helped me. So
what's it called?
Yeah.
What's it called?
The Magnus Archives.
Magnus Archives.
Yeah, it's a bunch of horror stories, and yet it's also the gayest thing I've probably ever consumed. It's great, but what I'm trying to get at, I guess, is that I'm really grateful for queer media that isn't just like that. I'm grateful for the coming out stories, but I also want like my gay fantasies, my gay horror, like just like I want like we have so much great, amazing media out there, and I'm so glad that it's not just coming out stories now. We get to be weird. We get to tell horror stories. So
Yeah.
that's my little bit. That's my shameless plug for it.
No, certainly the importance of representation in every aspect of life, right? It's important. It's important to see ourselves not only succeeding, but also failing, and also laughing, and also crying, and also yes, being weird and being perfect. We are all that, all of us. So it's great. It's great. It's a great reminder. And Rosa, certainly, thank you so much for sharing of you. I want to name that, sharing of you. And I know that when we do the work that we do in government, right, it has to be oftentimes very dry, very, to the point, very slow pace. But we also need to recognize that we are humans and that we are serving our community. So thank you so much. Certainly, I join Boji in thanking you for serving our community and our Asian community, our Pacific Islander community, Native Hawaiian community. Thank you so much, and certainly for the resources that you have on your website. We did mention real quick, we did mention two wonderful organizations here in Washington, VietQ and Utopia Washington. If you have the chance, if you have the chance to check out their websites and Facebook for VietQ and Utopia Washington for Utopia, check them out because they are doing amazing work. And in addition to that, as I said, CAPA has a bunch of other resources for LGBTQ Washingtonians of Asian descent and Pacific Islander descent. So check them out. We also have the same resources, but a little bit different, organized a little bit different. So if you're looking for resources specifically for the Asian American and Pacific Islander community, CAPA has them. So friends, again, thank you so much, Boji, Rosa, for sharing with us. To our community out there, I just want to reaffirm the Commission's the Commission's commitment to end white supremacy, to support Black lives, and to support the anti-Asian, the anti-Asian, sorry, to support any effort to prevent and end with the anti-Asian hate. And we continue working together. We are one community and we are in this together. So with that, friends, thank you so much for tuning in today. You can check out these later on YouTube where we are streaming and on the website for the commission as well. So